IO9 presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here are your hosts, John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 31 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Hi, I'm John Joseph Adams. I'm the editor of Fantasy Magazine and Lightspeed Magazine, and of a bunch of anthologies about wizards, zombies, dystopian societies, vampires, Sherlock Holmes, and other cool stuff.
And I'm David Barr Kirtley. I'm the author of many short stories, including Save Me Please, about a college student who disappears after becoming obsessed with an online role-playing game. The story appeared in Rich Horton's anthology Fantasy the Best of the Year, 2008, and also as episode 124 of the Escape Pod podcast. And today on the show, we'll be interviewing Chris Roberson. His novels include End of the Century, Paragaia, A Planetary Romance, and X-Men The Return. His short stories appear in magazines such as Asimov's and Interzone, and along with his spouse Allison Baker, he's the publisher of Monkey Brain Books. He's also written the comic book series Cinderella from Fabletown with Love and iZombie, and he was recently selected to complete the Grounded story arc on the Superman monthly comic book, a story that sees Superman walking across America in an attempt to reconnect with the people he protects.
All right, so let's get to our interview.
All right, so we're here with Chris Roberson. Welcome to the show.
Howdy.
So first of all, since you're writing Superman, could you prove to us that you're a real Superman fan?
What would you like to know? Would you like me to name off all the various kinds of kryptonite and what they do? Because
Yeah.
I can.
Yeah,
Really? I'll just do white. What does white kryptonite do? It kills plant life. It kills all plant life.
But didn't you, dress up as Superman, for months when you were a kid and stuff like that?
For entire years as a child, I dressed as Superman, yes. And basically until Halloween costumes fell apart. And then I would, for me, the introduction of the underoos in the late 70s was a godsend. Because I could dress like Superman all the time and no one would know. But yeah, I mean, I have a photographic record of me starting at the age of 6 and ending now of me wearing things with the Superman symbol on them pretty much constantly, including my honeymoon, because it's super romantic. The ladies love Superman t-shirts.
And I think you have more Superman comics than any other kind of comic, right?
I think that's fair to say, yeah.
Roughly how many is that?
Well, let's see. I'm just trying to do this by feet. Probably 12 feet worth. And I'm judging by the shelves in the boxes filled with Superman. And I'm going to guess about between 12 and 14 feet of spine-out Superman material.
For people who don't follow the comic all that closely, what has Superman been up to the last 10 years or so?
You know, in the olden days, before Crisis rewrote everything in 1986, Ma and Pa Kent died before he became Superman. But in the modern continuity, Ma and Pa Kent were still alive until a couple of years ago when Pa Kent died of a heart attack. So Pa Kent dies of a heart attack. Almost immediately thereafter, he discovers the bottle city of Kandor, which is an entire Kryptonian city shrunk down to bottle size, is restored to full size on Earth. There's suddenly a full community of superpowered Kryptonians running around. They build their own planet in Earth's solar system. Hijinks ensue. It all goes horribly wrong. Superman ends up as the last Kryptonian left flying around for various reasons. And he's pretty depressed about it. And the storyline that I'm currently writing kind of picks him up there. It was begun by J. Michael Straczynski, who did a few issues before. And I'm kind of coming in and doing the second and third acts. But the basic idea is that Superman is pretty emotionally broken. Superman, never having lost anybody before, never having experienced real personal loss or grief, in very short order loses his father and then an entire Kryptonian city filled with his distant relatives. And he's pretty messed up about it. And so the current storyline is him trying to re-examine what he believes in, and reconnect with his formative experiences to try to get back to a place where we'd recognize him as the guy who stands for truth, justice, and the American way.
Yeah, and didn't DC have some sort of contest to see what cities Superman would travel to?
They did. As I understand it, they had a basic route mapped out. and they invited anyone who lived in a town within 20 miles of that route to petition for Superman to come to their town. And they ended up sending me all of the winning entries for the last 8 towns. And the idea was that he would visit all these different American small towns. And so I mean, I know the names of the people responsible for him going to Lincoln, Nebraska, or Ogden, Utah. And so one of the interesting challenges of the storyline has been to make the story work, but also make it work in ways that are meaningful for the various locations he goes to.
Have you gotten any feedback on the Superman Grounded stuff that's come out so far?
So, yeah, some. I mean, I also did. I've gotten more feedback on 2 issues I did of a companion title called Superman Batman. I think there might be a / in between the 2. But the Superman Batman reaction was very positive. The Superman Grounded reaction to 707 has been split between people who absolutely love it and people who don't like it at all. And I think the don't like it at all people, many of them will be won over in another issue or 2. There's a lot of stuff that happens in my first installment of Grounded that gives long-term Superman fans pause. Because Superman in my first story doesn't act much like Superman. He has no faith in truth. And he's kind of a dick. And he's rude to his wife. And he makes the wrong choice. And that's because something has happened, which is that Superman's broken. So hopefully if the people that don't like it making the second issue, they can see that that's actually the story and not just that I don't know what Superman is all about.
Okay, so, I mean, one story that really made a big splash was the death of Superman in 1992. What do you think about that story now and its impact, looking back on it?
Well, it's funny, like, as a long-term comics reader, so I'm 40. I've been going to the comic shop every Wednesday for north of 30 years. And have been reading comics regularly since I was 6. The death of Superman happened right when I got out of college, right after college. And I interpreted it, I think, like most long-term comic fans at the time did, which was just a story. I mean, like, so they're going to kill off Superman and some stuff will happen, and then he comes back. Death is rarely permanent in comics. I think there's only 1 or 2 that were inviolate for a long time, and both of those have been overturned in recent years. For the longest time, the only deaths that were permanent were Peter Parker's Uncle Ben, Bucky Barnes, Captain America's original sidekick, and originally the Ma and Pa Kent. But by the last few years, all of those have at one point or another come back from the grave. So when they announced that Superman was dying, I was vaguely curious to see how they would do it and how they would bring him back. But the news hit on a slow news day and was picked up by media outlets who didn't know that superheroes were routinely killed and brought back from the dead. And they thought they were killing him. And it became a real thing. And I think the sudden, unexpected deluge of response and this incredible media attention on it caused them to slow the pace of the story so that rather than bring Superman back in 2 issues, or 3 as they probably originally intended, they dragged it out for closer to a year. I still think that it was a fine story. I think reading it in the aftermath, when you can sit down and say, here's the beginning, middle, and end of a story, I think that the writers and artists involved did a good job. And I think there's some interesting stuff in there, and it certainly introduced some interesting characters. I think Steel, John Henry Irons, who's the African-American engineer who builds himself a suit of armor to take Superman's place, and Superboy, who's a clone of Superman who's engineered by Project Cadmus to take his place, are both really interesting characters with tons and tons of storytelling possibilities. I don't know that I'd be eager for them to kill him off again, but Marvel just killed off Captain America a few years ago and then brought him back. And the stories that Ed Brubaker turned in for that arc were fan-freaking-tastic. The best Captain America stories we've had in years. So it's certainly a fertile ground for storytelling.
So what are some of your all-time favorite comic book stories involving Superman?
I mean, every time Alan Moore touched the character, it was fantastic. He did an annual, I think it was Superman annual number, I'm going to misremember. I'm thinking 10, but that's probably wrong. But it's called For the Man Who Has Everything, which basically Alien grants Superman his heart's desire, which is to see Krypton reborn. He also did Whatever Happened to Man Tomorrow, which was great. He did an entire series called Supreme, which doesn't actually have Superman in it because it was done by another company. But it's one of the best Superman stories ever made. Kurt Busiek did a great one called Secret Identity a few years ago, which was about a guy in our world who just happens to be named Clark Kent, and who's been tormented his entire life by everybody because he's named Clark Kent. People making jokes about it. And then he discovers he has superpowers. And it's just this really interesting story about what happens to a regular person in a real world that faces that kind of thing. In more recent years, Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely did a 12-issue miniseries called All-Star Superman, which is probably one of the best things that humanity has ever produced. If aliens ever arrive and ask us to prove our worth as a species, this is one of the things we can hand them, along with any kind of meat wrapped in bread and 30 Rock. Those are the things that can prove that we should continue to exist.
All right, so what are some of the strangest things to ever happen in Superman comics? Stuff where you just think, like, what were they smoking when they wrote this?
That's actually my favorite stuff. Anytime that Red Kryptonite was trotted out, or Mr. Mxyzptlk. I mean, Red Kryptonite is a variation of Kryptonite, which is the irradiated fragments of Superman's home planet that normally would cause him pain and then death. But Red Kryptonite passed through a cloud of radiation, which were pretty ubiquitous in 1950s and 60s DC comics. And the cloud of radiation altered the essential properties of the Kryptonite to make it red. And Red Kryptonite would cause Superman to undergo fantastic transformations that would last only 24 hours. So one time it caused all of his hair and fingernails to grow. I mean, that's the whole story. Good story. Another, he'll turn evil. He'll split to two people. He turns into a lion man. He turns into a giant bug guy. Basically any 1950s, 60s Mort Weisinger Red Kryptonite story is going to contain some of this craziest crap you'll see. Of course, Mxyzptlk is an imp from the fifth dimension, and, being 2 dimensions better than ours, denizens of the fifth dimension are able to do all kinds of crazy stuff. It's to say, he basically has the powers of, if we were to be interacting with people who lived on a sheet of paper, and we could suddenly fold the paper they're on or draw new things on it, they would be completely baffled. So any Mxyzptlk story is pretty high on that list. Probably the strangest, though, I mean, the things that people point out and think, what were they thinking? There's a Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane story from the early 1970s, 72 maybe, 73, called I Am Curious Black, in which Lois Lane undergoes a scientific procedure to be turned into an African American so she can learn what it's like to be black in America for a day. That's a pretty strange story. There's some weird stuff in that one. But interestingly, the African American kind of political activists that she meets in that story end up becoming really meaningful supporting characters in the Lois Lane stories throughout the remainder of the 70s. So as weird as that story is, it actually has some real worth to it.
So yeah, I heard once that the origin of the conflict between Superman and Lex Luthor is that Superman caused Luthor to lose all of his hair. Is that true?
Well, again, reality gets rewritten in comics constantly. So in the current continuity, the conflict boils down basically to Lex Luthor being the smartest, most capable human being on the planet until an alien arrives, and he feels that his position's been usurped, and that the presence of this alien is somehow limiting to humanity. So that's the new one. The old one, the good one, was that Superman made his hair fall out. Well, originally back in 1940, when the character was first introduced, he had hair, and he was just a mad scientist. He had a Zeppelin, he had a death ray, he flew around. But when the character was later reused, just a few years later, in the later 40s, the artist apparently forgot which one was Luthor on a panel, and rather than drawing the svelte, vaguely Eastern European red-haired dude, he drew the bald, vaguely overweight sidekick, his henchman, and that became the bald Luthor that continued to this day. In the middle period, the 50s, 60s, 70s, and early 80s, Lex Luthor was the red-haired wonderkind of Smallville, who was best friends with young teenage Clark Kent, and was working feverishly to devise an antidote for kryptonite, some sort of cure for kryptonite poisoning for Superman. But because of his hubris, he left his step out of the process. And while working in the lab outside town that Superboy had built for him, caused a chemical fire. When Superboy came to blow out the flames, it blew the smoke and chemical whatnot back at Lex, singeing all of his hair off. And from that day forward, he was an enemy of humanity and vowed revenge on Superman. Now, later, in the 1970s, once Julius Schwartz was the editor, Elliot Maggin, who was the writer at the time, revisited that story and added one little note that made it so much more interesting, which was that while he was working on this cure, teenage Lex also managed to create life from lifelessness in his lab. He created a living organism from base compounds. And it was nothing more than a fairly complicated, slime mold or something. But it was living, and this was Lex's child. This was he had done what no one else before him had been able to do, which was create life. And that when this chemical fire happens, when Superboy blows the stuff back in, it burns and kills off this mold that Lex has created. So that when Lex vows revenge against him, it's not so much because he's bald now, but that Superboy killed his child and killed his chance at immortality for doing this thing, which I think is kind of a cool story.
Yeah.
Well, that seems much more reasonable because really being bald isn't all that bad.
I mean, when you're working with a character with such a long history and so many, I would imagine, contradictory stories and things, how do you work around the continuity, and how do you decide which things to incorporate and which not to?
Superman, when he was first introduced, June of 1938, I think? It was 1938, I'm not sure the month. He came into focus very, very quickly. The things that we recognize as being Superman were present almost from the very beginning. And by 1940, early 41, with a few additions and emendations made by the writers of the radio show, which was syndicated across America, and the Fleischer Brothers cartoon series, the character we know was there. So what's changed, the contradictions over time have been minor bits of set dressing and then things that have happened to him. So that who Superman is, the last son of Krypton, raised by honest, hardworking farmers in the Midwest, who, disguised as Clark Kent, a mild-mannered reporter for a major metropolitan newspaper, fights a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way. That has not changed. What's changed is, did he meet Brainiac now or later? Does Lex Luthor have hair or not? Does he hate him because of the lack of hair, or is there something else? It's grace notes on the main tune, and the tune of Superman hasn't changed. So my approach to it, which I think has been the approach to Superman since the current editors took over. Matt Idelson took over as the editor a few years ago, and I think since he's been the editor, there's been this kind of sense of take from the past whatever works, keep from past continuity what makes for a good story. Whatever doesn't make for a good story, quietly ignore it. And that's pretty much what I've been doing. the issues I've written so far, and I guess I've scripted between Superman and Superman Batman, 5 issues so far, borrow from stories as old as 1940 and as new as things that are on the stands right now, and ignore all kinds of stuff in between too. So, yeah, I just take what's good and ignore what's bad.
Okay, so I mean, like over the years, I've heard a lot of people say that Superman is boring because he's too powerful and too much of a goody two shoes. How do you respond to that?
No, I don't think that he's boring. He becomes a very interesting challenge for the writers and artists to come up with something really interesting for Superman to have to defeat. I think that too often, when people try to tackle Superman, they try to come up with a physical threat that's difficult for him to defeat. Because he's stronger and he's faster and he can fly and he's invulnerable. And so they make someone that's a little bit bigger and a little bit faster and a little bit stronger that he has to punch until they fall down. Which is not that interesting. I mean, there's certainly a certain amount of visceral thrill that can be got from Superman punching a dude. But Superman has a wide array of powers and a super brain. He is a genius in intellect, as well as being a Hercules in strength. And so I think that it's just a really interesting challenge trying to come up with a story that puts in Superman's path a problem that can't be solved by punching it, but one that has to be resolved by something more clever, and then having Superman come up with a cleverer answer, which does not necessarily involve flying around the Earth backwards until time goes. Though I understand that does.
Yeah, so speaking of which, what do you think of the way Superman's been depicted on film and TV in recent years? The stuff like, Superman Returns and Smallville.
Rolling back a little bit farther, I think that the Bruce Timm Superman Adventures, the animated show that was on the Warner Brothers Kids Network, is probably the best outside of comics that Superman has ever gotten. That cartoon was just fan-freaking-tastic, and that led to the Justice League cartoon, which was equally as good. I think the first few seasons of Smallville were very good. I watched Smallville from the beginning and finally gave up when I just couldn't take it anymore a few years later. I think there's a lot of fantastic stuff in those first few years. I think that they built in their own problems. They were spoiled by success. If that had been a show that had run for 4 years, people would still be talking about how fantastic it was. I think making a story about Superman as a kid in school, learning how to be Superman, is a fantastic idea, and they did a fantastic job. As soon as he graduated and became an adult, the show was faced with the difficulty of working out what to do with an adult Clark Kent that's not Superman yet. And the problem I had personally with it was I was ready for that to happen. And so my personal frustration came from wanting him to put on tights and fly around, and that wasn't the story they were telling. As far as the movies go, I think that there's a lot to like in Superman Returns. It's not the movie I would have done, and I would have preferred that they wouldn't have stuck so close to the first 2 movies. But, I've seen it probably 10 times, and there's a lot of moments in it that I think are fantastic. I'm really, really curious to see what Chris Nolan does. I've been very impressed with what he did with the first 2 of the Batman relaunches. Him in the producer's seat could mean we might get a really, really good Superman movie out of the next one.
Actually, speaking of the American Way quote, wasn't there an alternate history storyline at some point where Superman actually crash landed in Soviet Russia or something?
Yeah. In the olden days, there were tons of imaginary stories in which he would land other places. But then, starting in the mid-90s, they did a whole line of Elseworlds, which were stories in which Superman ended up in different places. And one of the last ones was done by Mark Miller, who's now doing a lot of work for Marvel. But it's spelled in some crazy Scottish way with an A, M-I-L. But it's pronounced Miller. Called Superman Red Sun, in which he lands in Russia. And yeah, there he initially stands for, the Soviet way, for the Soviet man. But in all of the alternate universe stories that take place in DC Comics, there's apparently in that universe, all of its permutations, a certain narrative pressure. I mean, one of the fundamental forces of the DC universe is that Superman will put on that S and be a good guy. There's also a narrative force that says that something bad will happen to Bruce Wayne's parents, and he will become a creature of the night and frighten criminals. So that even though in all those stories he sometimes starts in different places, he always ends up in the same place.
So, do you have any advice for kids who might want to write superhero comics someday?
Well, yeah, I have a lot. The first thing is, A, read a lot of superhero comics, old ones too. B, read a lot of stuff that's not superhero comics. Read stuff that's not comics. Every successful writer of comics that I know of or know is also extremely widely read, inside of genre and outside. And the superhero genre is its own thing. So I think anyone that's read lots of science fiction or fantasy is helped. But also anyone that's read lots of history, or anyone that knows about science or politics or whatever. Life experience is a good thing too. Doesn't mean go get in a gang. I think, read good comics to figure out what they do well. Read bad comics to figure out what they do wrong. I always steer people towards reading really horrible comics, but suggest them to then figure out exactly what they would have done to fix it. And if you want to break into comics, find a paying work first, because it takes a very long time. I tried on a regular basis to break into the comics field for 18 years before I managed, and managed along the way to build an entire career in prose while waiting to break into comics.
Oh yeah, so who are some other superheroes that you'd like to write for?
I like Captain America a lot. I'm a big fan of Green Lantern. I love the Legion of Superheroes. Those are the big, most recognizable ones. I love the Doom Patrol. I think Crimson Avenger's fantastic. I would love to write a Ulysses Bloodstone series someday. He's dead, but we can fix that. It's comics.
Okay, and so your publishing house, Monkey Brain Books, published a book by Peter Coogan called Superhero: The Secret Origin of a Genre. Could you tell us what that book's about and why you decided to publish it?
Yeah, so Monkey Brain, when we first started, we published just nonfiction, but about genre. And then we started publishing nonfiction and fiction that involved genre. A lot of things that we published were things I found online or people that I had met that had interesting things to say. And Pete Coogan was a guy who he's an academic. He teaches, and he had done, I think, his master's maybe or his doctorate. I honestly don't remember which level it was, but he'd done some graduate level thesis on the superhero genre. What it entailed, where it came from, what constituted it, and for years he has run this academic conference that runs in San Diego at the San Diego Comic Convention in parallel to the regular convention. It's the Comics Arts Conference, I think it's called, something like that. And I'd known him a little while for those kinds of things. And he approached me with the idea for this book, which was an expanded version of his thesis. And having seen what he'd done so far, I was definitely interested in taking a look. So he handed it over. So it is, as his thesis was, an examination of where the superhero genre came from historically, what the principal developments in that genre were, and then what defines it. Like, this is a huge point of contention. What makes a superhero? What defines a superhero? Because virtually everything people can point at as being a defining characteristic, someone else can come up with a counterexample. The superhero has superpowers. Well, Batman does, and he's a superhero. The superhero wears a costume. Luke Cage does not wear a costume, really. Nor does he have a name, a superhero identity, which is the other defining characteristic people usually point to. Anyway, it's just an interesting book. We got Denny O'Neil to do the introduction for it. And I don't know that I agree with everything Pete says in it, but I think it's a really, really, really interesting book.
So what are some of the other comic book projects you're working on?
Let's see. I have a ongoing creator-owned book with Michael Allred, the creator of Madman, with Vertigo Comics. It's called iZombie, which is about a zombie girl detective. I'm doing a second spin-off of Bill Willingham's Fables, featuring the super spy character Cinderella, who is the fairy tale character reimagined as a modern-day super spy. And the other two big things I'm doing is I'm doing a space opera / superhero book called Starborn that was developed with Stan Lee at Boom Studios, and then with art by Kerry Randolph and colors by Mitch Gerards, and they're great. Gerards, rather. He's fantastic. And a 12-issue miniseries called Elric the Balance Lost, which uses a bunch of characters from Michael Moorcock's fantasy novels that Mike is overseeing as I write. Also for Boom Studios.
Okay, so, you've been quoted as saying, I believe in Superman the way some people believe in Jesus. Could you sort of talk about that quote and sort of what it is that about Superman that inspires that kind of devotion?
I think what it is that even though he's fictional, and that's something that has been pointed out to me by people who've seen that quote, that he's not real. Well, he's real and he matters. He's still fictional. He doesn't exist, but that Superman can stand as a figure of moral instruction. Anyone that's read more than a handful of Superman stories or comics or seen Superman movies or cartoons or encountered him in any number of other media that he's appeared in knows how Superman would react in any given situation. There's no moral ambiguities for Superman. There's no ethical dilemmas that would give him pause. Superman would act in a certain way. Superman would do a thing. So what I meant by that quote was that just like other people can look for moral guidance and instruction and spiritual support to religious figures, that I can look at Superman and know what he would do faced in any situation. And even though I might not always be able to measure up to it, I know what he would do. So you can boil it down to that. Well, it's a wristband, WWSD, and the answer is always apparent.
All right. Well, Chris Roberson, thanks so much for joining us on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Thanks for having me.
And that was our interview. So thanks so much to Chris Roberson for joining us on the show. So now we're going to be talking about superheroes, and I just wanted to mention, if you haven't listened to it already, that back in episode 4 of this podcast, we interviewed Marjorie Wu, who writes the Dark Wolverine series for Marvel Comics. And, then after that, John and I talk about sort of, comic books and how we got into them and some of our favorites and stuff like that. And so, definitely go check that out if you're interested. All right, but so we're, a whole bunch of superhero movies are coming out soon, and a bunch of trailers have been released recently, so I thought we could start out and talk about some of those. So first up, Green Lantern. Did you see the trailer for that?
Yeah, unfortunately. It looks pretty dismal. Yeah, man, I don't know. I just, I saw that. Unfortunately, I saw it before Tron Legacy, which was also quite dismal. But it was, God, it was just it looks so bad. I mean, I don't know. I can't even really explain it. It's, I've never been less enthusiastic about the superhero movie that I can remember from the trailer. Just from the trailer, it's like, how do you make the Green Lantern look not interesting? I mean, that's a really interesting superhero, but they made it look really lame. Yeah,
no, it was just really a truly ghastly trailer. I was watching it. I was half convinced it must be some sort of fan spoof or something,
Mm-hmm. Instead of talking about Green Lantern, can we talk about Alfred Bester?
Well, I was actually just about to mention that, yeah.
He used to write Green Lantern, and he wrote the Green Lantern Oath.
Oh, actually, that's apparently not true.
Really? That's the way I've always heard that.
No, that's the way I always heard it too. Which is why I went and looked it up, but Wikipedia claims otherwise.
I see.
But yeah, I mean, if people don't know, the Green Lantern Oath goes, "In brightest day, in blackest night, no evil shall escape my sight. Let those who worship evil's might beware my power. Green Lantern's light." And so it's been widely believed that was written by science fiction author Alfred Bester, who wrote The Star's My Destination and The Demolished Man. But according to Wikipedia has this thing, and it says, Bester has been credited as the creator of this oath. However, in an interview with journalist F. Gwynplaine McIntyre at the 1979 World Science Fiction Convention in Brighton, England, Bester stated that the Brightest Day oath was already in place before he began writing for the character. So...
Actually, speaking of F. Gwynplaine McIntyre, it's kind of a tangent, but I mean, did you hear about, he died recently. Did you hear about like the circumstances of his death?
No.
So he was like a longtime fan, true fan, as they say in fandom. He went to science fiction conventions like his whole life, and the sort who would have probably read and collect fanzines and that kind of thing. But so his apartment burned down. He lived in New York, and his apartment burned down, and they found the body there, but there was like some controversy whether or not it was actually him, and they thought maybe he had faked his death and all this other stuff, and there was some sort of crazy correspondence between him and the police, I believe, and he had some very strange events happen right immediately prior to his death. So it was a very, very very distressing sort of report when you were reading about it. Because I mean, this is a guy that I've been to conventions with, and he'd be sitting in the row right in front of me, at a panel or something, and then to hear about all this crazy stuff that happens, like sort of associated with his death, it was a bit shocking to say the least. And I guess there was a lot of debate whether or not like that was his real name, and where he was actually from. It's like, I mean, it kind of sounded like from what I heard that almost nobody really knew who he was, and that his whole life may have been an elaborate fiction, that he just would tell people that he created it all himself, that like none of the background that he told people was real, and that kind of thing. I mean, nobody who said that seemed to have any idea why he'd done that, but apparently that was the case. So it was interesting. It was interesting to read about, if a bit, morbid. But it's been confirmed now that he didn't fake his death and stuff. Like, I'm fairly certain that it was confirmed that yes, that it was him. That they did find somebody who could like identify the body or something.
Wow. Okay. So moving on to our next superhero movie trailer, Captain America. What'd you think of that? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a really brief trailer, but I don't know. It looks pretty interesting. I kind of wish we could have gotten more of a glimpse of the Red Skull there. I mean, I don't know. Did you read that? Did you read Captain America? I've never read it. No.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I when I was reading comics, it was one of the titles that I read, pretty seriously, and I like how they added the subtitle, The First Avenger, to sort of help set up the Avengers movie that will follow. It's like, hey, Captain America and Avengers, they go together, in case you didn't know. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I mean, it looks pretty good. I mean, the shield looked cool, and his outfit looks pretty cool, which was certainly a concern. I mean, trying to translate his costume to something that's going to look recognizable yet look feasible in the real world was quite a challenge. And I don't know, it looks pretty good so far. I mean, from the it's a very short trailer, so it's hard to say for sure how that'll play in the movie. But
yeah, no, I think the trailer is reasonably good. I was actually, I've been listening to a bunch of other sort of science fiction geek kind of podcasts just to sort of see what else is out there. And I was listening to this one called Slacker and the Man, and they were talking about that, and they were saying that they were supposed to have like a full trailer for the Super Bowl, but it ended up just being a teaser trailer because they didn't have enough like good footage to use. Oh no! So if that's true, that's not really a good sign. The guy also on this podcast, it sounds like he really doesn't like Chris Evans, the actor who was playing Captain America. Yeah. From what I gathered, it sounded like they just cast the guy who's going to be Superman in the Chris Nolan movie. And that actor said, that he was a big fan of the Superman comic. And the guy in the podcast was saying, that he appreciates the actor saying that, even if he's not really a Superman fan, that, it was nice that he would at least say that he is, And he says, Chris Evans could take a lesson from that guy. So. Oh, why did he come out and say that he doesn't like Captain America? I don't know. I just before this I tried Googling it. I couldn't find exactly what Chris Evans had said. I did come across something he said, like I'm going to be in this Avengers movie. I don't really know what it's about. So maybe that was it. But so like, yeah, I mean, when you were reading Captain America, like how did you get interested in that, and like what kind of stuff was going on like in the story during the period that you were reading it?
Well, like I started reading Captain America probably because of Avengers, and I mean, I don't remember why per se I picked up Avengers. I mean, I was a Marvel guy, so I mean, I ended up trying a bunch of the comics just because they were in the Marvel universe, you know. And there's always these crossovers, you know, like Spider-Man I think is the first one I read, and you know, so you know, maybe the Avengers showed up in Spider-Man at some point or whatever, and so I was like, oh, maybe I should check out Avengers, but. And then Avengers, of course, would lead you to the various members of the Avengers who had their own books, which includes Thor and Captain America well, Iron Man was in was the Avengers West Coast division. Although originally I guess he was in Avengers, but when I was reading it, he was in the Avengers West Coast. Yeah, so Captain America, you know, I mean, he fought a bunch of his sort of iconic villains in like the Red Skull and whatnot, and you know, even, you know, 50 years later after you know, after World War II, it's still fighting the Red Skull. But anyway, I mean, that's what I remember most vividly about it from that period. But
well, like when you were saying like, you know, he's been fighting Red Skull for 50 years and he's still fighting the same guy, I was kind of wondering, like, he's been fighting for 50 years and he's still a captain. Like, what's that guy got to do to earn a promotion? Yeah,
I know, right? You think he would get a promotion after all this point, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know. They never really addressed that part of it. Maybe he's like Captain Kirk and he wants to refuse promotions so that he can keep doing the job that he's suited for, you know? Or at least, I mean, I guess, you know, Captain Kirk actually does take the promotion, but then realizes that he should have never taken a promotion past captain because that's what he's good at. But,
well, so how about the Thor trailer? What'd you think of that?
Yeah, that one, I don't know. I'm a little bit more dubious about. I mean, when I heard about the Thor movie, I was pretty skeptical just because, like, again, that was a costume that I thought would be really hard to transition to the real world, although I think they do an okay job with it. But I mean, all of the Asgard stuff, like, I don't know, it kind of looks, you know, Asgard is the realm where Thor lived with the Norse gods and all that. You know, with him being cast out by Odin and all that, like, I don't know, some of that stuff looks a little cheesy. But I don't know. We'll see. I mean, it's cool to have Anthony Hopkins as Odin. I mean, that's cool. I don't know about this guy who's playing Thor. He looks the part anyway.
In the trailer, the whole Asgard thing, it looks very science fictional. Is that the way it is in the comic?
I don't remember it being that way. I mean, I remember it being pretty, you know, just pretty fantasy-esque. You know, very very much what you would expect of Viking heaven. You know, or whatever. So. I mean, it looks like Loki is there, and, you know, Loki's always Thor's nemesis, and both in mythology and in the comics. I'm not sure who that giant armored guy who was blasting stuff out of his visor was supposed to be. Again, I mean, I haven't read the comics in so long. Maybe it's somebody I'm just not thinking of. But I mean, nobody immediately came to mind. Yeah, I don't know. I'm fairly skeptical of that trailer, but you know, I mean, I'll see it, I guess. Maybe I'll wait and see what people think.
Oh, okay. So how about the X-Men First Class?
Yeah, that one looks pretty promising. I mean, I don't know. It's a pretty bold move, taking the X-Men back before, like, everyone's favorite Wolverine is in it or anything, and it's just like Charles Xavier and Magneto. I'm not clear who all the other characters are. It looked like Beast was in it, maybe. I mean, unless that's just some other guy who looks like Beast or something, or. Who's flying the plane there? Did you see the? Yeah,
no, I know what you're talking about. I'm not sure what.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I don't know all the history of the X-Men characters either, but you know, I mean, the trailer looked pretty slick anyway, and it looks like it's taking the concept fairly seriously. Although the trailer does lean very heavily on JFK. I assume that plays into the storyline somehow, that they're going to have to fight off communism or whatever. But
I think I heard it's the Cuban. This is like the real story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, right. There were like mutants involved and stuff.
Right. You know, I mean, that sounds pretty cool, actually. Yeah, no, I mean, it looks pretty slick. I mean, they've got some good actors in there. Like at least that's Michael Fassbender, right? Is Magneto. So I mean, he's a good actor. I'm not sure who the guy who plays Xavier is.
Oh, it's James McAvoy.
Oh, that's him. Okay, yeah, okay. So, yeah, no wonder Genevieve geeked out about that trailer.
But yeah, I think that's definitely the most promising of the four. Okay, and so now we're going to move on to our next topic, which is superheroes in prose fiction. There's a bunch of really good things along those lines. Sort of the first thing that came to mind that I wanted to talk about was this Tim Pratt story called Captain Fantasy and the Secret Masters that appeared in Realms of Fantasy magazine years ago. And it was on the Podcastle podcast. It's Podcastle Giant number 4, if anyone wants to go check it out. But it's really cool. It's very much a sort of Captain America style story. Except, instead of Captain America, it's this guy named Captain Fantasy. And he has really powerful superpowers where kind of stuff that he imagines just comes true. But he had been injured, and he had fought in World War II. And, his sidekick had died and stuff. But this Captain Fantasy guy, he has, amnesia. So that it's sort of like in the movie Memento where, he remembers the past, but he can't form new memories as a result of his injuries. And so he still thinks it's World War II and he still thinks that they're fighting the Nazis and stuff. And so they kind of keep him in this bunker, where because it's sort of too dangerous to let him out because of how powerful his superpowers are. And because he's so confused and stuff. And so they just kind of keep him in this bunker and sort of, keep up the illusion that it's still World War II, just sort of to keep him happy. But then a situation arises where they need him to save the day. And so they really have no choice but to let him out. And so the main character is a sort of, shape-shifting kind of guy. And so he impersonates Captain Fantasy's sidekick and is sort of supposed to be his handler and, point him in the right direction and try to keep him, under control. And so, it's just kind of funny stuff like the first moment that they're alone, Captain Fantasy kind of, grabs him or kind of embraces him and kisses him. And it turns out that Captain Fantasy and his sidekick were lovers. And that kind of makes the situation a little uncomfortable for the protagonist. But there's just a lot of really, sort of really clever, twists on sort of superhero stories and things.
I want to see that movie.
Yeah. Another one I read recently, another sort of superhero short story that I thought was really good was by Saladin Ahmed. It's called Dr. Diablo Goes Through the Motions. And you can listen to it. It was episode 158 of the Travelcast podcast. It's very short. I mean, it's just a couple minutes long, I think, but it's sort of told from the point of view of a sort of disillusioned Latino villain, sort of super villain, and sort of at a meeting of the supervillains, and just kind of the part that struck me the most is the leader of the supervillains is sort of laying out their evil scheme, and he's describing one of the heroes that they're going to be fighting, and Dr. Diablo says, quote, "You don't need to go through all this. I can guess his goddamn origin. Disaffected rich kid, fled America and trained with mystical Eastern warriors, soon became the best. 1 year at ninja camp is always enough time for a gringo to get better than any native. He defeated the jealous Eastern ex-best warrior, screwed the prettiest Eastern girl, earned the respect of her dad, some old guy with a white mustache who's been waiting all his life for a white boy to come to his school, came home and decided to fight crime. Am I right?" And actually, Saladin, he linked to a sort of on that same thing. He sort of linked to this funny website where it's called Uncomfortable Plot Summary, or what is it? Uncomfortable Movie Summary, something like that. But it's like the plots of famous movies, given like a one sentence, TV guide style synopsis, but phrased in such a way that it just kind of makes you uncomfortable, about the movie. And so the one for Batman is wealthy man assaults the mentally ill.
So one of the things I wanted to mention, which is sort of, it's not a short story, it's a novel, and it's sort of off the beaten path for as far as superhero things go. But there's a novel called Pandemonium by Daryl Gregory. Did you read that?
Mm-mm.
So
I heard it was really good. I didn't realize it was a superhero.
Yeah, it's an awesome book. I mean, and it's his first novel, so it's really impressive. I mean, I've read a bunch of his short fiction that was great, but it's his first novel. So it's not really like, it's kind of hard to call it a superhero novel, but I think if you like superhero fiction, you should certainly check it out. So it sort of takes place in this world where, like, there are these demons that have possessed people throughout the years, right? And as when he was a child, the protagonist was possessed by this demon known as the Hellion, who was known for sort of targeting kids like him. And but then he got better, except that he starts to think that, well, maybe the demon never really left, and that maybe something else is going on inside of him. And so like as the story progresses, it sort of becomes clear that these demons are sort of these, they're sort of these archetypes that we know from comic books. And so like, there's a demon that's called like the Captain and stuff like that. So it's like a sort of a Captain America type thing. And it's like, and so like when the people got possessed by these demons, they wouldn't necessarily go and do like something heroic, say like as the Captain demon, but it would sort of like go off and do like something warlike and violent or whatever, because like it's like this warrior persona or whatever. So I don't know, it does something very interesting with the whole idea of demons. I mean, it's a very interesting book about if you want to read something about demons. But then like also I just think if you like superhero fiction, definitely check it out, because it does a lot of interesting things with those archetypes. And I mean, essentially, it's like what he's talking about in the book is not all that different than any other superpower. And it's like, it's like, oh, well, is it a superpower because you're a mutant or because you're possessed by a demon? I mean, what's the difference, right? I mean, if you end up with some sort of superpower because of it, then it's still a superpower. And actually, one of the other things I was going to mention was also a novel, Soon I Will Be Invincible by Austin Grossman. And that's more of a traditional superhero narrative, but that one's also excellent if you're interested in something like that. But
I was just going to mention also two other sort of superhero novels that came to mind were Nobody Gets the Girl by James Maxey, and then also Playing for Keeps by Mur Lafferty is sort of available as a sort of free podcast novel, and I've heard that's really good too. And of course, going back to short stories, you have like the Wild Cards anthology series, and they just re-released the first one, and there's a bunch of other ones that have just come out recently.
Yeah, the re-released version of the first Wild Cards book actually has some original material in it too. So even if you have read the original one, there's some new stories that they sort of meshed into there by like contemporary authors. Like I think Carrie Vaughn and David Levine and some other people have new stuff in there.
Yeah.
But also speaking of short stories, Lou Anders did an anthology called Masked, which is all superhero stories. It's got like Bill Willingham who does Fables, Marjorie Liu, Mike Carey, and a bunch of other people in there.
Well, I just picked that up this week, and I just sort of started reading some of the stories. It's really good, the ones I've read so far.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite story that I've read so far is called Thug by Gail Simone. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of it's told from the point of view of a kind of supervillain henchman kind of guy who has a low IQ. The voice, it sounds very much like Charlie Gordon from Flowers for Algernon. It's sort of that kind of character. Mm-hmm. And it's just I was kind of getting like choked up reading it. It's a really sort of sad, touching story. And so I read it and I was like, wow, that's great. And so I was curious about the author. And so I Googled her, and she writes superhero comics, but she did that website, Women in Refrigerators. Do you know that website? It's like, I guess that's, it's like, it sort of lists like bad things that have happened to female characters in comic books and kind of asks whether there's a sort of disproportionate victimization of female characters. Mm-hmm. And then different comic book creators, respond and stuff. It's interesting, but, do you know why it's called Women in Refrigerators?
No.
So apparently there was like this infamous scene in one of the Green Lantern stories where like the Green Lantern comes home and like his girlfriend has been murdered and stuffed in the refrigerator. And so, it's just a really like extreme famous scene. There was another high profile superhero anthology that came out recently called Who Can Save Us Now? This was one of the editors was Owen King, Stephen King's son. I actually went and saw they had a reading for this at McNally Jackson Bookstore, which is a great bookstore, parenthetically, if you're in Manhattan. But he was saying that Owen King and his wife, they were watching that Meerkat Manor show, and he just said like, when it somebody should write a story about a meerkat man superhero. And, and his wife was like, well, you should write that. And he was like, well, where would you ever publish a meerkat man superhero short story? And, so he just kind of put the idea aside. And then just he kept thinking about it, and he really wanted to write it, and just decided that he would edit the whole anthology. If he's like, if I edit a whole anthology of superhero stories, then that's a place I can publish my Meerkat Man superhero story.
There's actually there's another couple. There's two other anthologies that come to mind on the subject. There's one called The Darker Mask that was edited by Gary Phillips and Christopher Chambers. The subtitle is Heroes from the Shadows, which it's sort of like the dark and gritty side of superhero fiction. So it's like it's not like people like Superman. It would be somebody who's sort of closer to the street, sort of thing. So there's some interesting stuff in there. And actually, years and years ago, I mean, this was like from like 1996. John Varley had one just called Superheroes, and it's got stories in it by like Roger Zelazny and some other people, but I don't really remember it too well. I mean, I definitely had it and I read it at some point, but it sort of started my opinion of how difficult it is to translate superhero fiction or superhero stories into prose fiction, whereas like it feels very natural to read about them in comics, I guess, because that's where we first encounter them in general. But when you try to take that same style of storytelling and you just apply it to prose fiction, it can be much more difficult to sell to the reader, I mean, it could have just been that I was young when I read this and, that I didn't get into it for that reason. Maybe I would appreciate it now. But, I mean, it took me a long time to really, to find, superhero fiction, in prose form that really worked, for me the way that comics did. And, anyway, I mean, this one certainly was way ahead of the curve as far as this goes. I mean, it's a good 10 years ahead of, any of these other superhero anthologies. So.
Well, like speaking of superheroes in formats other than comics, I mean, there were a couple sort of superhero role-playing games. There was one. I've heard that George R. R. Martin say that the Wild Cards kind of grew out of a superhero role-playing game called Super Worlds that he was playing. There was one from Palladium that I used to play as a kid called Heroes Unlimited. Did you ever do any of those?
Yeah, well, I mean, no, I never played either of those. I did play the Marvel Superheroes role-playing game, which I thought was awesome. It was I mean, because probably the most fun about that was, well, I mean, it was a lot of fun to play, but I mean, really also, it was also a lot of fun just making characters, because they had a pretty sophisticated system for building a superhero. And so, you could just spend hours and hours, just making up new superheroes and thinking about what combinations of powers would be cool to go together. And if you use the randomization factor, I mean, cause like you would roll to get what your statistics were, but then also you could roll to get what powers, your superhero would end up with and everything. So, it could be a lot of fun to sort of end up with like these sort of oddly paired superpowers and then trying to come up with an explanation like why does this character have these two different kind of powers, and how does that work together, and what kind of superhero would he be if he has those powers and that kind of stuff.
I've heard George R. R. Martin say that when he sort of got obsessed with the super world and rolling up characters, was one thing he really got fixated on, and that he was supposed to be writing and he would actually be rolling up superhero characters, and his partner Paris would come in and sort of listen at the door, and if she heard dice rolling, she would kind of like shake her head and like, oh, he's at it again. But no, I did actually play this Heroes Unlimited game, and so I just kind of Googled it just recently, and I kind of nostalgically looking at the cover and stuff, and they had posted the author's introduction from the book, and one thing about that caught my eye is the author of that role-playing game says, quote, "Oh, one last comment. The term superhero is a registered trademark held jointly by the Marvel Entertainment Group and DC Comics. The term superpowers is a registered trademark of DC Comics. Except in this introduction where I specifically refer to real comic books, I cannot legally use those two words, superhero or superpowers, terms all us comic book readers know and love. Well, I'd hate to be sued, so you'll see references like super abilities, extraordinary powers, superhuman, super beings, and so on. Sheesh, what a business, eh?" Have you ever heard of that?
No, that's crazy. And how could the government like give them a trademark on that? I mean, that's lame. But doesn't a trademark get weakened by when people don't defend the trademark like usage, like because like for instance, like I remember like reading a Writer's Digest when I was younger, and I saw it was like an ad to writers saying like, don't use the word Kleenex when you mean tissue because that because that's like inappropriate use of their trademark. And the same thing with Xerox. Like, don't say Xerox when you mean photocopy because that's an inappropriate use of their trademark. And apparently, I mean, from what I understand, like, if you don't defend, like, if you don't protect your trademark, then it sort of becomes something that can't be trademarked anymore. Like aspirin, I think, was also trademarked at some point, but then everybody just used the word aspirin as a generic for whatever you would call aspirin generically. And then so it just became a term that couldn't be trademarked anymore. So I mean, how could superhero still be trademarked at this point? You would think that must have been used so commonly and by everyone that it couldn't possibly be trademarked anymore. But I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, so. Actually, speaking of superheroes though, and Marvel trademarking stuff, did you hear about this T-shirt company that Stan Lee's company is suing because they have a bunny on their shirt and he's saying "pow." He's punching something and then the word balloon says "pow" and it's got like a sort of a jagged edged word balloon. And Stan Lee's company is like suing them for trademark infringement or something. And it's like, what?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer either. There's just so many like weird things going on here. I mean, one of the things is that, the companies, as I understand, they have to sue they have to sue or threaten to sue everybody, even if they don't really want to, or else they might, lose their trademark. So I suspect that, they don't actually really care if the guy uses PAL on the t-shirt, but if they don't, they, for some reason they feel that they have to, but,
well, the Stan Lee thing is really lame because I mean, if you Google it, we'll try to find a link for it in the show notes. But I mean, they were showing like what Stan Lee's trademark is and what they have on their shirt, and there's no way that that's trademark infringement. You know what I mean? It's like it's not the same thing. It's like you can't trademark the word "pal." It's a word. And it's like so it's like a ridiculous suit. I mean, I understand what you're saying that if it was the case where they felt like well, we don't want to sue this guy, but we have to defend the trademark, but in this case, it was just ridiculous.
Even if you were to grant that they can trademark the word superhero, my understanding of trademark was just that you couldn't use it in the title or like to identify the product. So you couldn't have a game called Superheroes Unlimited. I don't understand why you can't use the word superhero in the text of a book, a role-playing game book. That just blows my mind. I don't get that at all.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe a trademark lawyer will chime in, but maybe the guy who wrote the introduction actually misunderstood that. Because that makes sense to me too. That like you wouldn't be able to use it in the title, maybe, but how could they stop you from using it in a book? But I don't know.
Yeah, if there are any trademark lawyers listening to this show, let us clear this up for us, please.
Well, I mean, because like for instance, like Band-Aid is a trademarked. A trademark of Johnson & Johnson or whatever, right? But I mean, like if you mention Band-Aid in a story, it's like you're not going to get sued for trademark infringement. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you titled your story like Band-Aid or something, like maybe you get in trouble. But
no, I think it has to be like a similar product. So like because I've heard of things like a company will be trademarked, something like Sunrise Computer Company or something. And you could still have like the Sunrise Hot Dog Company, without violating their trademark. It has to be like something that could be confused, two businesses that could be confused with each other or something.
Right.
But I don't know. We need a lawyer. We need a lawyer on this one, I guess. I guess just the other thing I was going to mention is that have you seen the Marvel Zombies thing that came out?
You mean the comic series?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I've seen Marvel Zombies. Yeah.
Because I found that I came across that in the bookstore and I read it. I thought it was fantastic, but a lot of the artwork was done by this guy Greg Land, and actually I thought his art was kind of interesting, and so I went and Googled him afterward, and it turns out there's this big like controversy over him and how he puts his art together. Have you heard about any of this stuff?
No. I
don't know. It sounds like people sort of say that he kind of like takes photos from the internet and from magazines and kind of traces them and, maybe just photoshops them a little bit and stuff and sticks them in the comics. And I guess, there's like a long tradition of comic book artists using photo referencing and stuff, but people, some people sort of think that this maybe goes too far in that direction. But so it's kind of funny because people will go through the comics and like find, and then go online and find the picture, And so there's like this photo of Magneto and Marvel Zombies kind of putting his helmet on. And then there's a picture of Brad Pitt from Troy putting his helmet on, and it's like exactly the same picture. You know, like even like the patterns of light and darkness in the background are exactly the same and stuff. And but then one kind of thing is, I guess, what people suggest anyway is that a lot of the sort of photo reference that this guy uses is actually like porn, and so you know, so there'll be like a superhero like screaming as they get blasted by an energy beam or something, but he's actually like traced some pornographic image, you know, where the character is screaming for some entirely non-energy beam related reason. And so people are saying that like once you notice this, it gets really distracting. They call it like quote unquote porn face, because they say like you read the comics and you just like see porn face everywhere. And also like, you know, a lot of the characters are like celebrities, and so like, you know, you're just looking at Mr. Fantastic or whatever, and you're like, wait, is that Topher Grace? I think it is. You know, so I don't know. I guess we can have a link in the show notes. I found there's a pretty hilarious like discussion thread where people you know, post examples of that, and it does, you know, it just kind of brings up sort of interesting issues about, you know, with all this new technology and Photoshop and stuff, how legitimate is it to you know, how much manipulation do you have to do to an image before you can call it yours, you know, stuff like that.
I would think that would be a case of like, you know, we discussed on the show before, like when Naomi Novik was on, the idea of transformative works. You know, you think that would be sort of a transformative work. No, I mean, it's like he's taking something out of the context in which it was used originally and transforming it completely, you know, into something else that's not even, you know, it's like a different character, and or it's a character in a comic book and all that. So I don't know. I think that would be covered by that sort of usage, but who knows? Like, you know, like I said, I'm not a lawyer. So that was our episode. If you want to help support the show, remember we do take donations. If you go to geeksguideshow.com and you can click on the PayPal button there and send us a donation, we'd appreciate that. And or if you just want to support the show in other ways, you can go to iTunes and leave a review or a rating there. We're up to 31 ratings, so if you want to go and give us another 5 stars or something like that, we'd appreciate it. And tell your friends about the show. And thanks for listening.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of IO9. For this episode's show notes, to subscribe to this podcast, or for more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your hosts, visit johnjosephadams.com or davidbarkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by Slipgate 9 Entertainment. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.